Hey friends, my name is Sam Collins, and today we're going to create this awesome chain melting transition effect all inside of Blender. This project uses almost everything Blender has to offer, from its modeling tools to geometry nodes, setting up custom shaders, and even using physics simulations. So follow me along as we create this awesome animation that you can use for your portfolio.
So starting out in Blender, I'm using version 3.6. I'm going to exit out of the splash screen, and then on my keyboard, I'm going to hit A to select everything, and then X to bring up this window. It's going to ask if I'd like to delete all this. I'm going to select delete. Next, I'm going to hit 7 to come into top view. If that doesn't work for you, you need to come here to edit, and under preferences, come to input, and make sure that emulate numpad is selected. Once you're in top view, you need to hit Shift A on your keyboard and import a torus. From here, I'm gonna come up here to toggle X-ray mode, and I'm gonna turn that on, and then I'm gonna select Tab on my keyboard and zoom in a little bit to our torus. And then using our mouse cursor, I'm gonna select half of the torus and hit G on my keyboard and X to pull this out along the X-axis. I'm gonna pull it out to about right here. Next, I'm gonna come here to this middle selection and hit Control and R on my keyboard, and then scroll up on my mouse wheel to add more loop cuts. I'm gonna do the same thing down here. Control R, and then scroll up on my mouse wheel to add more loop cuts. And then I'm gonna double click to apply them. From here, I'm gonna select everything by hitting A on my keyboard. I'm gonna hit Shift and D to duplicate this shape, and then click out of it. And then I'm gonna hit G and X to move this along the X-axis. And I'm gonna move it to about right here. From here, I'm gonna hit R and X and then type in 90 on my keyboard to rotate this 90 degrees. Next, I'm gonna toggle out of X-ray mode and hit Tab on my keyboard to exit edit mode. Next, I'm gonna zoom out a little bit. And then here, under our modifiers panel, I'm gonna add in an array modifier. You'll notice that once we add it in, it's gonna be offset a little incorrectly. So here under the X factor, I'm gonna pull this back a little bit. I'm then gonna zoom out some more and up our count here to 7. From here, I'm gonna select our chain, right click and hit Shade Smooth. Next, I'll come here to our array modifier and hit Apply. Then I'll hit Tab to open up edit mode and hit A to make sure everything's selected. From here, I'm gonna right click and hit Separate by Loose Parts. I'm gonna exit out of edit mode and make sure I'm in object mode. And with everything selected, I'm gonna come here to Object, Set Origin, and select Object to Origin Center of Mass. Next, I'm gonna hit Tab once again, hit A to make sure everything's selected, U on my keyboard, and hit Project from View. This is gonna help us out later on. I'm gonna select Tab to exit edit mode. Next, we're gonna set up our physics simulation. I'm gonna select one of our chain links and come over here to our physics properties. I'm gonna select rigid body, and here under shape, where it says convex hull, I'm gonna change this to mesh. Next, I'm gonna come to our 3D viewport and hit A to select everything and make sure that our chain link is selected last. From here, I'm gonna go to Object and come here to Rigid Body and select Copy from Active. Next, I'm gonna come to our scene properties, and under Gravity, in the Z property, I'm gonna change this to 0. Next, I'm gonna hit Shift A in our viewport and add in a force field. The type I'm gonna select is a turbulence force field. Then in our physics properties, I'm gonna change our strength to 64. I'm gonna change our size to 0.5. And under noise amount, I'm gonna change this to 2. Next, I'm gonna hit spacebar to see if our simulation is working. And this is looking really great. Next, in our timeline, I'm gonna make sure we're at frame 1. Then in our 3D viewport, I'm gonna hit A to select everything. And here in our scene properties, I'm gonna come down to rigid body world, cache, and under ending, I'm gonna type in 350. And then here in ending, under our timeline, I'm gonna type in 350 as well. Next, I'm gonna select Bake All Dynamics. And now we've created a really nice chain floating simulation. Next, we need to move on to creating our geometry node setup. Before we do that though, we need to come here to our scene collection and do a little bit of organization. I'm gonna select all of our chain links and hit M on my keyboard and move them into a new collection. I'm gonna call this collection Chain 1. Now over here in our scene collection panel, I'm gonna collapse Chain 1 and then right click and add new collection. I'm gonna call this collection Geometry Node Setup. Next, I'm gonna turn off our chain so that we can't see it in our viewport. And then with our geometry node setup selected, I'm gonna come in here to our 3D viewport and hit Shift A and grab a cube. With our cube selected, I'm gonna come here and open up our geometry node editor and then select new to create a new geometry node setup. I'm gonna zoom in and grab our group input node and hit X to delete it. Then I'm gonna grab our chain from our scene collection panel and I'm gonna drag it down in here to our geometry node setup. I'm gonna set the setting to relative and connect our instances output into our geometry node input. I'm gonna set the setting here to relative and then connect this socket to our group output. You notice that once I do that, our chain not only appears in our scene, but it's also respecting its physics simulation. From here, I'm gonna start adding in some more nodes so that we can create a really nice displacement effect. The first node I'm gonna add is a subdivision surface node. The next node I'm gonna add is a realize instances node. Next, I'm gonna add a set position node. Next, I'll add a set material node. Next, I'm gonna come up here to our 3D viewport and I'm gonna hit Shift A and I'm gonna select empty and I'm gonna select empty sphere. I'm gonna hit S on my keyboard to scale this up and then hit Control A to apply that scale. I'll come back here to my geometry node setup and I'll grab our empty object here from our scene collection panel and I'll drag that down in here to our geometry node setup. I'm then going to add a position node by hitting Shift A and typing in position. Next, I'm gonna add a vector math node by hitting Shift A and typing in vector math. I'm gonna set this setting to distance and then I'm going to connect our position here and our location here. Next, I'm gonna hit Shift A to add a math vector node, and I'm gonna set this to multiply. I'm gonna connect our distance node to our new vector math node here. Then I'm gonna hit Shift A and import a map range node. I'm gonna change float to vector, and I'm gonna connect our multiply node here to our new map range node. Here on our multiply node, I'm gonna change these settings to 0.31, and on our map range node, I'm gonna change these settings to 0.86. I'm gonna change our from max value to negative 0.42. I'm gonna set our 2 min to 0. And then finally, I'm gonna set our 2 max value to 3.4. Next, I'm gonna hit Shift A to add another vector math node. I'm gonna set this to multiply, and then I'm gonna connect our map range node to this. I'm gonna set this to 0.48, and then I'm gonna hit Shift A to add in another vector math node. I'm gonna set it to multiply, and I'm gonna connect these two nodes here. Next, I'm gonna hit Shift A to add in a noise texture, and I'm gonna connect the color into the vector here. I'm going to change our noise texture from a 3D to a 4D noise texture. I'm gonna set our W to 2.5. I'm going to set our scale to 0.26. I'm going to set the detail to 0, the roughness to 0, and the distortion to 8.32. Next, I'm gonna hit Shift A to add in one more vector math node, and I'm gonna set this to multiply. I'm gonna connect these sockets here, and then I'm gonna hit Shift A and add in a normal node. I'm gonna plug the normal into this vector here. And lastly, I'm gonna connect this multiply node into our offset. And once I come up here to our 3D viewport, and I'll come back here in our timeline and set this to 1. And you'll notice now our sphere is interacting with our chain and it's causing it to displace along the normals. And I really like this effect. I think this is really nice. So I'm gonna select my chain and I'm gonna come back in here to geometry nodes, and we've got a couple more things in here to do before we head into shader nodes. First, here in our set material, I need to tell it what material to apply to our chain. So I'm gonna come over here to our material editor and I'm gonna create a new material. And I'm gonna call this material chain. And then back in our geometry node editor, I'm gonna select this and make sure that chain is selected. Next, in order to transfer some data from geometry nodes into our shader nodes editor, we're gonna add in a store named attribute node. In order to do that, I'm gonna hit Shift A and type in store named attribute. I'm gonna apply this after we realize our instances. Next, I'm gonna change this to vector, and the value we're gonna connect here is our distance vector here. And I'm gonna call this UV. Now we've completed our geometry node setup. So here in our shader editor, we're gonna have to create two materials. I'm gonna come up here to my viewport. I'm gonna type in Z2 to bring up our material view. And down here in our shader editor, under base color, I'm gonna move this to kind of a darker kind of gray. And then under metallic, I'm gonna move this to 1. And under roughness, I'm gonna bring it almost all the way down to 0. I think right here should do. Next, I'm gonna create our gold material. I'm gonna hit Shift D on our silver material, and then I'm gonna come into the base color, and I'm gonna bring it down here to kind of a yellow, kind of goldish color. Maybe bring the brightness up a bit. And then here to preview it, I'm gonna plug it into our surface. And I think this is looking pretty good. Next, we need to kind of create something that's gonna mix between these two shaders here. And so in order to do that, I'm gonna grab our silver material and I'm gonna make sure it's plugged into our material output. And I'm gonna hit Shift A and I'm gonna type in mix and I'm gonna add a mix shader. And I'm gonna plug our silver into the top and then I'm gonna plug our gold into the bottom. And now I need to tell Blender how to mix these two colors. So in order to do that, I'm gonna hit Shift A and I'm gonna bring in a gradient texture. And I'm gonna set this to easing. Next, I'm gonna hit Shift A and bring in a color ramp. I'm gonna grab our white value here and kind of bring it in to about right here. And I'm gonna connect our gradient texture into our color ramp. Next, I'm gonna select our gradient texture and hit Control T on my keyboard, and it's gonna give it a mapping node and a texture coordinate node. Here on our texture coordinate node, I need to change it from generated to object. And the object I wanna use is gonna be this sphere. Next, I'm gonna grab the color output here and connect it into our mix shader. And you'll notice that once I do that, our sphere is now controlling the mix between our materials. So next, we need to set up our emissive material. In order to do that, I'm gonna come over here to our mix shader and I'm gonna duplicate it. I'm then gonna grab this gold material and I'm also gonna duplicate it. I'm gonna set our base color to black and I'm gonna kind of grab some of these nodes here and shift them over so that we can give ourselves a little bit of room here to create our emissive material. I'm gonna plug in this here and then really quickly, I'm also gonna set up our factor. By hitting Shift A, I'm gonna import an attribute node. I'm gonna set this attribute to our UV. I'll bring in a mapping node. I'll then bring in a color ramp node. And finally, I'm gonna hit Shift A and bring in a gradient texture node. I'm gonna connect these all together. I'm gonna set our Y value here to 0.2. And then under scale, I'm gonna set all of these to 0.29. I'm gonna grab our color ramp here. I'm gonna flip the values. And then I'm gonna take the color output and plug it into our factor here. Next, I'm gonna come down here to our emissive material that we're gonna create. And I'm gonna change this to orange just to start out. And once I up our emissive setting here, you're gonna start to notice that we're getting this really great kind of glowing effect occurring throughout our displacement. And so the next thing we're gonna start to do here is just kind of fine tune this material shift here. And if we come over here to our render properties, we're in Eevee, I'm gonna turn on ambient occlusion. I'm gonna set this to 2. And then I'm gonna come here to bloom, turn that on. And then I'm also gonna turn on screen space refractions. And then I'm gonna, like I said, begin to build out this material. First, I'm gonna hit Shift A and I'm gonna bring in an attribute node. And I'm gonna type in under name UV. And then I'm gonna plug this into a color ramp. Here on this black color, I'm gonna change this to kind of a reddish orange. And then on our white value here, I'm gonna change this to kind of a yellow orange. I'm gonna plug the vector into here. Next, I'm gonna hit Shift A and import a texture coordinate node. And then I'm also gonna hit Shift A and import a mix color node. I'm gonna change mix here to subtract. And then I'm gonna plug in our UV from our texture coordinate here to our factor. Next, I'm gonna build out a Voronoi texture that's gonna kind of create this crackling effect here where our textures are mixing together. In order to do that, I'm gonna hit Shift A and search for Voronoi texture. With my Voronoi texture selected, I'm gonna hit Control T to bring in a mapping and a texture coordinate node. And here in our texture coordinate node, I'm gonna change it from generated to object. I'm then gonna go to our Voronoi texture node and change it from F1 to distance to edge. And I'm gonna set the scale to 25. Next, I'm gonna add in a color ramp. I'm gonna flip this color ramp. And here on this white value, I'm gonna make this kind of a darker gray. And then I'm gonna push this black value in to about right here. I'll connect our distance to the factor, and then I'll plug the color into the B part of our mix node. I'm then gonna select our color ramp here and plug that into the A part of our mix node. I'll then take the result of that and plug that into our emission. Next, I'm gonna plug this color ramp up here into our base color, and then I'm also gonna add in a bump node by hitting Shift A, typing in bump, and then connecting our color here to the height, and then connecting our bump node here into the normal. And what this is gonna do is kind of allow the light to catch these little cracks and just add a little bit more visual appeal to our animation. Now that we've created our materials, we can move into setting up our scene. In order to do that, I'm I'm gonna switch here from object to world. And here where our background node is, I'm gonna select it and hit Control T on my keyboard. I'm then gonna import an environment texture that I've downloaded from polyhaven.com. I went ahead and downloaded the 4K version. And now back in Blender, I'm gonna open it up and use it to light my world. Now that we've imported it and set our strength, I can come up here to my viewport and hit Z8 to see how it's looking. I think this looks really good. Next, I'm gonna come here to our render properties, and under film, I'm gonna select transparent. While I'm here in my render settings, I'm also gonna make sure that bloom and screen space reflections are selected as well. And now we're done setting up our scene. Next, let's come up here to our compositing layout. Let's select use nodes, and then we're gonna add in a couple nodes here to get our scene looking really good. First, I'm gonna add in an alpha over node by hitting Shift A and typing in alpha over. I'm gonna plug it into our second socket here, and then where this white value is, I'm gonna make this black. Next, I'm gonna add a glare node by typing Shift A and searching for glare. I'm gonna change our streaks setting to simple star. I'm then gonna set our mix to -0.99. From here, I'm gonna go back into our layout, and then over here under this dropdown, under compositor, I'm gonna select always. Now we can move into setting up our camera and outputting our final animation. I'm gonna come in here to our timeline. Next, I'm gonna come here to our 3D viewport, and I'm gonna type in Z and then 6 to just come into solid view. Next, I'm gonna show overlays. And next, I'm gonna kind of zoom out here, and I'm gonna hit Shift A, and I'm gonna import a camera into our scene. Come over here to where this camera is, and I'm gonna grab it and kind of put it out here. That seems about good. And the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click here on constraints, and I'm gonna add an object constraint. And I'm gonna select track 2. I'm gonna take my eyedropper and I'm gonna track this onto our empty. And so you'll notice now, as I move this empty object, our camera is gonna start following it. And so that's really nice. And so now that our camera is kind of tracking to this sphere, we're gonna animate this sphere along our chain, and it's gonna create kind of a cool animation for us. So firstly, I'm gonna grab our sphere, kind of put it at the beginning of our chain here, and then I'm gonna hit I on my keyboard, and I'm gonna set a location keyframe. Then I'm gonna pull forward on my timeline to about, let's say 70, and I'm gonna move this sphere along my chain. Let's say to about right here. I'm then gonna pull forward more on my timeline, let's say to about 120, and I'm gonna bring my sphere up to about right here. I'm gonna add in another keyframe. And so then I'm gonna come here to about 180, and I'm gonna add another keyframe. I'm gonna make sure that our sphere is kind of traveling along our chain still, so that our displacement effect is still occurring. I'm gonna set a keyframe here, and then I'm gonna come right here to like 230, let's say 220, and let's set one more for this sphere object kind of coming out this way. There, great. And let's set a location keyframe here. And so if we come back here and hit 0 on our keypad, it's gonna bring up our camera view. And then I'm going to go to the beginning of our timeline and hit spacebar, and let's see this play out. So yeah, I think this is really cool. I think our last bit here is kind of happening a little bit too fast. So I'm gonna adjust this last keyframe. I actually think a lot of it is happening a little bit too fast. So I'm gonna hit A to select all these keyframes, S and X to scale them out, and just kind of move everything over a little bit. And this is gonna slow everything down a little bit. It's gonna allow us as viewers to kind of maybe appreciate our animation a little bit more. And so let's hit 0 to go back into our camera view, and let's see how things are going now. It's a little bit slower. Cool. Oh, and so it looks like right here, we need to kind of add in another keyframe so that our empty kind of stays consistently going along our chain. So I'm just gonna add in a keyframe here, maybe delete this one here, and let's see what we have. Go back to my camera view here. Okay, great. And so now that we've animated our sphere along our chain, next I think we need to animate our camera to kind of follow this sphere. And so in order to do that, I'm gonna select our camera. I'm gonna come back here to frame 1, and I'm gonna come up here to our 3D viewport and hit I on my keyboard and set a location keyframe for the camera at the beginning of our animation, and then down here at the end of our animation, kind of where this sphere falls off of our chain, let's say, yeah, right here about 300. I would like for that camera to be kind of have followed our sphere all the way to the end of the chain here. So now I'm going to set a keyframe here at the end. And back up here in my 3D viewport, I'm going to hit A to select everything, and then come down here into my timeline and A to select all of these keyframes. And then I'm going to just right click and set up the interpolation to Bezier. So finally, we need to come over here to our render properties, and we want to make sure that everything here is set up correctly. I'm going to make sure that we're in Eevee. I'm going to set our render output sampling here to, let's say, 150. I'm going to set our ambient occlusion to 2. I'm going to make sure that our screen space reflections are on. Next, we're going to come to our output properties, and I'm going to make sure that everything here looks kind of nice. We want our composition to be 1920 by 1080. We want our frame rate to be 24 frames per second. And then we also want to select where we want this to save to. And next, under file format, we have a couple options. Traditionally, most people output their frames individually as PNGs and then stitch them together, whether it's inside of Blender or another program like After Effects. I have a video on that here if you'd like to watch it. In this case, we're going to output our video as an FFmpeg. And in order to do that, all we have to do is come up here to render and hit render animation.
In closing, I hope you had fun creating this awesome animation with me inside of Blender. In the end, I wound up adjusting some settings to get my final animation, and I encourage you to do the same to make it your own. I'm excited to see what you create. If you enjoyed my content, make sure to subscribe for more tutorials and motion graphics inspiration in the future. Thanks.